Okay, let's go. Number 1. Aokigahara Forest. The year is 1970. You're a volunteer walking into Aokigahara for the first organized search this forest has ever seen, and you're already regretting the tape hanging off your belt. Not because you don't need it, because you do. Aokigahara sits at the northwest base of Mount Fuji, and it isn't planted on soil. It grew directly out of the lava field left behind when Fuji last erupted, back in 864. Over 11 centuries, roots have cracked through solid rock. Trees have grown sideways around boulders that never moved, and the whole thing has filled in so completely that from above it looks like a single dark carpet. Locals call it the Sea of Trees. You can see why the second you're inside it. You tie the first strip of tape to a branch at the trailhead. You'll tie another one every few hundred feet for the rest of the day, and not as some ritual. It's how you get back out. The forest covers about 12 square miles, and inside it every direction looks exactly like every other direction. No landmarks. No slope to follow downhill, because the ground is nearly flat lava rock under a thin layer of soil and moss. No real trail once you're 50 feet off the marked path. People who wander off the path have been found days later less than 650 feet from where they started, completely unable to find their way back to a trail they never really left. There are caves down in that lava rock too. Hollow tubes left behind when the surface of the flow cooled and hardened while the molten rock underneath kept moving and drained away. Some of them stay cold enough year-round to hold ice through the height of summer. People go looking for those caves on purpose, with flashlights and rope, and the forest above ground swallows the trail back up before they're even done exploring below it. You don't need a ghost story for that kind of disappearance. You just need rock that hollows itself out in the dark, and a canopy thick enough to blot out any sense of which way is which the second you climb back to the surface. Here's where it gets strange. Ask almost anyone about Aokigahara, and they'll tell you the compasses don't work, that the volcanic rock is so loaded with magnetic iron it scrambles every needle the second you cross the tree line. That part isn't quite true. Hold a compass at normal height and it reads fine. The iron in the lava can throw a compass off if you set it directly on the rock, but that's not how anyone actually navigates. The real danger is dumber and worse. A forest so visually identical in every direction that your own sense of direction fails you within minutes. Cell signal drops to nothing under the canopy, and the silence is so complete that searchers say they can hear their own pulse. That's not folklore. Just what 12 square miles of undifferentiated forest does to a human brain that evolved to navigate by landmarks. And somehow, it gets worse. The trees themselves absorb sound. Dense growth, thick moss, volcanic rock underneath that doesn't carry an echo the way normal ground does. Walk 50 feet into the interior, and the wind noise from the trailhead is just gone. No birds calling to each other, no rustle carrying from one side of the forest to the other. Searchers describe it as walking into a room with the door shut behind them, except the room is 12 square miles wide, and the door was never really there to begin with. Since 1970, the year you're standing in right now, Japanese police and local volunteers have run an annual sweep through the forest, usually timed before the New Year holidays. A typical year turns up somewhere between 50 and 100 bodies. Not one big anomaly. A number that repeats, season after season, decade after decade, in a forest that has never stopped being exactly as easy to disappear into as it was the day it grew out of that lava field. You walk in grid lines with the rest of your team, spaced close enough that nobody drifts out of sight of the person next to them, because the same forest that's about to be searched has already proven, over and over, what happens to people who wander even a few dozen feet from a group. I mean, think about that for a second. This has been a standing operation for decades, not a one-time tragedy or a single bad winter. A government-run, calendar-scheduled search through the same stretch of woods, year after year, because the forest itself hasn't changed and doesn't plan to. The searchers know this. That's why they carry the tape. Not to mark a trail for someone lost ahead of them. To make sure that when they turn around, the forest hasn't already erased the way they came in. Aokigahara isn't even the oldest forest on this list, or the strangest reason people stop coming back. Just the one with paperwork. A government agency that shows up on schedule because it already knows what the woods are going to do this year. Most of the forests on this list don't have an annual sweep. They don't need one. Nobody organized enough has ever gone looking hard enough to need a schedule for it. Take the forest outside a Transylvanian city that doesn't have a search operation, a police unit, or a body count. What it has is a name that comes from someone who walked in a very long time ago and simply never came back out. Number 2. Hoyabachu Forest. The year is sometime before anyone thought to write it down. You're a shepherd outside Cluj-Napoca, and you walk your flock, all 200 of them, into a stretch of woodland the local Romanians will eventually name after you. Baciu. Shepherd's Forest. Neither you, nor a single one of your sheep, ever walks them back out. Nobody finds bones. Nobody finds a trampled path, or a torn scrap of wool caught on a branch. 200 animals and one man go into the trees, and the trees simply keep them. That's the origin story, and it's the reason the forest carries a name at all, instead of just being one more patch of woodland outside a Romanian city. Hoia covers about 620 acres on the edge of Cluj-Napoca in Transylvania, and somewhere along the way it picked up a nickname that gets used constantly in the travel writing about it, the Bermuda Triangle of Romania. For a patch of woodland you can walk across in an afternoon, that's a heavy comparison to earn. What came after the name is harder to pin down and a lot more disputed. Local tradition puts the number of people who vanished inside Hoia somewhere around 1,000 over the years, a figure that gets repeated constantly and verified almost never. One of the most told versions involves a 5-year-old girl who wandered in during a walk with her family, then walked back out 5 years later wearing the exact same clothes, not a day older. Say that story out loud and it sounds like a fairy tale, because that's basically what it is at this point. A piece of oral history that's been polished by decades of retelling until nobody can tell you which parts happened and which parts got added somewhere around the 40th time someone told it at a campfire. Here's where it gets strange, and where the forest stops being just a good story. People who actually walk into the forest's interior, especially near a roughly circular clearing at its center where almost nothing grows, report physical symptoms that show up consistently enough to have their own name in the local tourism material. Unexplained rashes, headaches that hit within minutes of entering, nausea, burns and scratches nobody can account for by the time they're back at the tree line. That's not a 5-year-old returning unaged. That's dozens of separate visitors, strangers to each other, describing the same physical reaction to the same specific patch of ground. Some of them go in as skeptics, specifically to test the reputation, and come out describing the exact same headache the last skeptic described, which is either a remarkable coincidence repeating itself for decades, or evidence that something about that clearing is doing something measurable to the people who stand in it. The modern reputation kicked into gear in the 1960s. A biologist named Alexandru Sift photographed unexplained discs over the treetops, the kind of image that would have gone nowhere in most places, and instead became the first thread of an entirely new layer of the forest's story. Then, in 1968, a military technician named Emil Barnea took his own photograph of what looked like an unidentified flying object hovering above the canopy, and that image is still the one most often cited whenever anyone brings up Hoia outside Romania. UFOs, ghosts, disappearances, all filed under the same forest, all part of the same reputation that turned a shepherd's name into shorthand for the most haunted stretch of trees in the country. Paranormal investigators started showing up by the following decade, and they kept coming, decade after decade, each one adding another layer of report on top of what was already there. Tour groups eventually followed the investigators, then camera crews followed the tour groups, until a forest that used to be just a name shepherds warned each other about turned into a stop on the international paranormal circuit, complete with guides who walk visitors to the exact clearing where the symptoms are supposed to start. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time, and it's worth saying plainly instead of letting the legend run unchecked. Official missing person statistics for the region don't actually show Hoia producing more disappearances than any other Romanian forest of comparable size. No spike in the paperwork. No official record that lines up with 1,000 missing people. Some of that gap is just how record-keeping worked in the eras the oldest stories come from, thin and inconsistent long before anyone was cataloging rural disappearances with any rigor. But some of it is simpler than that. The legend outran the evidence a long time ago, and it's been running on its own momentum ever since. And that's somehow the part that sits with you longer than the ghost stories do. A forest with a name built entirely on disappearance, decades of consistent physical symptoms reported by strangers who've never met each other, photographs of things nobody can identify, and a paper trail that can't back up even a fraction of what the legend claims. The gap between the story and the record is its own kind of unsettling, because it means somebody built an entire reputation for a forest without needing a single verified case to do it. Whatever is actually happening in that clearing, whether it's geology, psychology, or something nobody's identified yet, it's been happening consistently enough, to enough different strangers, that the absence of a police file doesn't make the forest feel any safer to the people who've actually stood inside it. Hoyabatsu runs on legend outrunning its record. The next forest on this list has the opposite problem. No thin paperwork, no folklore doing the heavy lifting, just a body, found exactly where the story said it would be. Number 3. Freetown Fall River State Forest. The year is 1978. You're a 15-year-old girl named Mary Lou Aruda, and you're riding your bike near your home in Raynham on September 8th, the kind of ordinary afternoon that doesn't feel like the last normal hour of your life while you're living it. You don't come home. The next day, someone finds your bike on the side of the road. 2 months later, your body is recovered inside Freetown State Forest, tied to a tree. That's a police case, with a date and a name and a location that anyone can look up, not folklore. And it happened inside the forest, sitting at the center of what a cryptozoologist named Loren Coleman named the Bridgewater Triangle in his 1983 book, roughly 200 square miles of southeastern Massachusetts, with a documented history that runs a lot stranger and a lot darker than most true crime pulled out of small towns. You'd think a name like that comes from one dramatic incident that snowballed into a nickname. It doesn't. The triangle earned its reputation across decades of reports, layered one on top of another, long before anyone put a formal boundary around it on a map and gave it a name people outside Massachusetts would recognize. 2 years after Aruda's murder, the forest produced another case, and this one had a name attached to it that made the whole thing sound less like a crime and more like a story nobody wanted to believe. In 1980, police investigated a string of killings connected to reports of a cult operating in and around Freetown. 3 young women were murdered. Doreen Levesque, 17. Barbara Raposa, 19. Karen Marsden, 20. The cases became known as the Fall River Cult Murders, and they happened inside and right outside the same stretch of trees that had already taken Mary Lou Aruda 2 years earlier. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time, and it's the kind of thing that never made the front page the way the murders did. Through the same stretch of the 1970s and 80s, locals kept finding mutilated cattle carcasses turning up at random spots deep inside the forest. No pattern to when. No obvious explanation for how a full-grown animal ends up gutted in the middle of state land without a single witness. On their own, mutilated cattle read like a farm accident nobody wants to explain. Layered on top of 2 documented homicide cases from the same handful of square miles, they start reading like something else entirely. Local investigators at the time openly connected the animal reports to the same cult rumors driving the murder investigations, which meant a single forest was carrying an active homicide case, a string of unexplained animal deaths, and a community that genuinely believed something organized and dangerous was operating inside the tree line, all at the exact same time. If you're enjoying this, subscribe, because we've got 7 more of these, and some of them get a lot stranger than a police report. The Bridgewater Triangle carries a documented history that predates any of this. Reports going back to colonial times describe strange lights, phantom sounds, animals that don't match anything in the local wildlife guide, Bigfoot sightings, giant snakes nobody's ever caught. The kind of regional folklore that exists in 100 other places in America and usually amounts to nothing more than campfire stories passed between hunters. What makes the Bridgewater Triangle different is that its folklore sits directly on top of a real, documented, solvable crime record. A 15-year-old's murder, 3 more homicides 2 years later, animal mutilations nobody explained. The scary part in this forest has court records, not a shepherd nobody can verify vanished centuries ago. Locals who grew up near the forest describe a specific unease that has nothing to do with any single incident, more a general sense that certain sections of Freetown just feel wrong to be in alone, especially after dark. That kind of feeling doesn't hold up as evidence of anything on its own. Plenty of ordinary woods produce the same reaction in plenty of ordinary people who've never heard a single story about the place. What's different here is that the feeling turned out to be right at least twice, with a name and a date attached both times. And that's not even the part that got people the most unsettled, long after the cases themselves went cold. It's that the pattern didn't stop with the 80s. Reports out of the same 200 square miles kept coming. New sightings. New strange animal reports. New, unexplained lights, over the same tree line that had already produced 2 documented murder cases within 2 years of each other. A forest that's already given up 1 confirmed body doesn't get the benefit of the doubt on everything that happens inside it afterward, and Freetown has 2 confirmed bodies and a documented cult investigation on the record. Compare that to almost every other reputedly haunted patch of woods in the country. Most of them are trading entirely in stories nobody can verify. Second-hand accounts from someone's cousin, a campfire tale that's grown a new detail every time it gets retold. Freetown State Forest doesn't need the embellishment. It has a 15-year-old's name in a police file, a location where her body was recovered, and a second case 2 years later with 3 more names attached to it. Whatever else is true about the Bridgewater Triangle, that part isn't up for debate. Freetown State Forest earned its reputation the hard way, with a real name and a real court record behind it. The next forest earned a different kind of reputation. Not from a single homicide, but from something that took root over 2,000 years and never really let go. Number 4. The Black Forest. The year is somewhere in the 1st century, and you're a Roman soldier posted at the edge of a mountain range in what will one day be southwestern Germany. The Celts who live near it already have a name for it, tied to a forest deity they call Abnoba. You have your own name for it, and it's the one that survives. Silva Nigra, Black Forest. Not because the trees are dark in color, but because the canopy grows so dense that almost no sunlight reaches the ground beneath it. You stand at the edge of it in daylight, and it looks like dusk 50 feet in. That impression doesn't fade with familiarity. It just becomes the thing everyone who lives near the forest learns to live with. The folk tradition that grows up around the Schwarzwald, the German name that eventually replaces the Roman one, is documented back roughly 2,000 years. Witches, shapeshifters, forest spirits that predate Christianity in the region by centuries and never fully get replaced once it arrives. And then, in the 16th and 17th centuries, that tradition collides with something a lot more lethal than folklore. The European witch trials hit the Black Forest region especially hard. Dense, dark terrain that already carried centuries of supernatural fear, isolated farming communities cut off from each other by exactly the kind of woods that made travel slow and communication slower, and a wave of religious conflict tearing through the same period. Put those 3 things in the same place, and accusations spread fast. Thousands of people, most of them women, were executed across the region during those 2 centuries. This was a sustained, documented, multi-generational body count tied directly to fear of what the forest itself represented, not a single dramatic incident. Neighbors accused neighbors, a bad harvest, a sick animal, a child's fever with no obvious cause, and someone living on the edge of the trees became the explanation the whole village needed. The forest didn't do the accusing, but its darkness gave every accusation somewhere plausible to point. Here's where it gets specifically strange, because this part is a fairy tale you probably already know, not a ghost story. In 1812, the brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published their first collection of folk tales, and they drew heavily on stories collected from the Black Forest and the Rhine Valley region to fill it. Hansel and Gretel, 2 children abandoned by their own parents and lost in deep woods, wasn't invented out of nowhere. It came out of exactly this region's storytelling tradition, the same tradition that had spent 2 centuries turning witch accusations into executions. Every kid who's ever heard that story has absorbed a piece of the Black Forest's actual regional history without knowing it, filtered down into something safe enough to read to a 5-year-old at bedtime. So yeah, not great, considering the story started as something a lot closer to a warning than a bedtime read. The Grimms weren't inventing horror out of nothing. They were collecting it from people who'd grown up hearing it as a real caution about a real forest, passed down from families who'd lived at the edge of the Schwarzwald for generations and knew exactly how easy it was for a child, or an adult, to walk in among those trees and not walk back out the same way they went in. The werewolf legend is the thread that outlasts almost everything else tied to the forest. Humans who transform under the full moon, hunting the old forest roads at night, terrifying travelers who had no choice but to move through the Schwarzwald if they wanted to get anywhere at all in that part of Europe before modern roads existed. It's rooted in ancient folklore that predates the witch trials by centuries, and it kept getting told long after the trials themselves ended, because the forest that produced both stories never actually changed. Same density, same darkness 50 feet past the tree line, same reason travelers moved through it in groups whenever they could manage it. Even now, with paved roads cutting through sections of the Schwarzwald and tourists driving through on scenic routes, the older, denser stretches away from the highways still carry that same 50-foot rule. Step off the road and the light drops fast, the same way it did for a Roman soldier standing at the tree line 2,000 years ago. Local guides still steer hikers away from certain unmarked stretches after dusk, not because of any specific recent incident, but because 2,000 years of accumulated caution doesn't evaporate just because the roads got paved. The real question is what happened behind closed doors during those 2 centuries of trials, because the court records that survive only tell part of it. The confessions themselves, extracted under conditions nobody would call fair by any modern standard, describe meetings deep in the forest, gatherings under trees far enough from any village that no one could witness what actually happened there. Whether any of that was real or entirely coerced, the forest itself became a permanent character in the accusations, the backdrop every confession kept returning to. Dense, isolated forest communities cut off from each other made accusations spread fast, and 200 years of that, backed by a religious tribunal, turned into thousands of executions. The Black Forest earned its reputation doing something a lot more human than anything supernatural, and a lot harder for the region to walk away from. It gave an entire region the physical conditions that let fear turn into a body count, generation after generation, and by the time the trials finally ended, nobody in the region could talk about the forest without talking about what it had cost them. And the Black Forest isn't the only culture on this list that built an entire mythology out of the same fear, independently, with no contact with any of the others. A forest whole civilizations feared for 2,000 years is one kind of terrifying. Therefore, when a modern explorer walked into an even older, even less mapped forest looking for a lost city, almost nobody expected him to just vanish. But that's exactly what happened. And it happened to more than just him. Number 5. The Amazon rainforest. The year is 1925. You're Colonel Percy Fawcett, and on April 20th you walk out of Cuiaba with your oldest son Jack and Jack's lifelong friend Raleigh Ramel, headed into the Mato Grosso jungle to find a city you're convinced is real. You've named it Z, not a metaphor. A specific location you believe exists somewhere in this uncharted stretch of the Amazon basin, built by a civilization nobody in the outside world has documented, and you've spent almost 2 decades of your life chasing the evidence that convinced you it's out there. This isn't your first attempt. Between 1906 and 1924, you'd already made 7 separate expeditions across the Amazon, and twice already you'd been driven back out of this exact region, beaten by fever, exhaustion, and weather that doesn't care how determined you are. You know what this jungle does to a body. You know what it did to the last 2 attempts, and you're going in anyway, because at this point Z is the thing you've built the second half of your life around. And you're not the kind of man who walks away from a search this close to the end of his career just because the jungle has already tried to stop you twice. On May 29th, you're seen for the last time at a site your own notes name Dead Horse Camp. Somewhere in the Mato Grosso, 3 men who walked in together simply stopped being anywhere anyone can find them. No bodies. No confirmed remains. Not that year, not the next, not across the following century. Fawcett, his son, and Raleigh Ramel just end, mid-sentence, in the middle of the largest rainforest on Earth. Fawcett himself had asked, before he left, that if the expedition failed, nobody should mount a rescue attempt. He understood exactly how unforgiving the terrain he was walking into actually was, and he didn't want anyone else risking the same fate chasing after him. Almost nobody listened to that request. Word of the disappearance reached the outside world slowly, since Fawcett had deliberately avoided regular check-ins to keep rival explorers from tracking his route to Z, and by the time people understood he was truly gone, the silence itself had become its own kind of evidence that something had gone badly wrong. Here's where it gets strange, and where this story stops being about 3 missing explorers and starts being about how far people will go to answer a question that already killed the man who asked it. Starting in 1928, a wave of rescue expeditions went in after Fawcett, one after another, year after year. A popular legend that's been repeated for decades claims as many as 100 would-be rescuers died across more than a dozen separate search attempts, swallowed by the exact same jungle that took the man they were looking for. That's the number you'll hear in almost every retelling of this story, and it's worth being straight about it. Careful modern accounting suggests that figure is likely exaggerated, that the real death toll among searchers was probably a fraction of that. But probably smaller doesn't mean zero. People really did die searching for Fawcett, and the popular version of this story just kept rounding that number up, decade after decade, long after anyone could check it. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, whichever version turns out to be accurate. 100 deaths, or considerably fewer. Either way, you're talking about search parties walking into the same jungle that had already erased 3 trained, capable men without a trace, and somehow that didn't stop the next expedition from going in anyway. Or the one after that. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense, even a century later. The most credible modern reconstruction of what happened to Fawcett's party comes from oral testimony held by the Kalapalo people, combined with later research into the region and the timeline. It suggests the 3 men died within days of that last sighting at Dead Horse Camp, likely from illness, starvation, or violence tied to territory they'd entered without invitation. Days, not weeks of surviving in the wild before something finally caught up with them. Days, for 3 men who had trained their whole lives for exactly this kind of expedition. And still, 100 years on, no bodies have ever been confirmed. Not Fawcett's, not his sons, not Raleigh Rammel's. Whatever actually happened at Dead Horse Camp stayed inside a jungle that has never given any of it back to any of the dozens of expeditions, professional and amateur, that have gone looking in the century since. Explorers, journalists, documentary crews, and outright treasure hunters have all tried their own version of finishing what Fawcett started, some of them using his own notes and coordinates as a starting point, and the jungle has treated every one of them exactly the same way it treated him. Total, indifferent silence. The Amazon is millions of square miles of largely roadless, largely unmapped terrain, nothing like a small patch of woods with one local legend attached to it, and it proved, conclusively, that even a famous explorer with decades of experience and a search effort that lasted generations isn't guaranteed to leave a trace behind when it decides not to give someone back. The Amazon swallowed a search effort a century deep and still hasn't finished keeping it secret. But there's a forest in Europe old enough to remember what the Amazon looked like before recorded history started, and it has its own reasons. Nobody goes past the tree line unescorted. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. Bialowieza Forest. The year is roughly 10,000 BC, right after the ice sheets that covered northern Europe finally pulled back. You're one of the first trees to take root in the newly exposed ground, straddling what will eventually become the border between Poland and Belarus, and you're about to spend the next 12,000 years as part of something almost nothing else on the continent gets to be. A forest that never gets fully cleared. While the rest of the European plain gets logged, farmed, and rebuilt across thousands of years of human settlement, this particular stretch keeps standing. Untouched isn't quite the right word. Managed, guarded, hunted in, but never leveled. By the 1400s, that management has a name and a purpose. Polish kings hold exclusive hunting rights across the forest, starting in the 14th century, and by the following century King Władysław Jagiello is personally hunting inside it. That's over 600 years of continuous, deliberate, royal-level control over the same stretch of trees, not abandoned wilderness. A guarded reserve, restricted to the people at the very top of the political order, for longer than most modern nations have existed. What survives because of that control is staggering by any modern measure. More than 350,000 acres of forest remain today, sections of it estimated at roughly 12,000 years old, making Bialowieza the last major fragment of the primeval lowland forest that once stretched across the entire European plain, from what's now France all the way east into Russia. Almost every other piece of that plain has been cleared, farmed, and rebuilt across 10,000 years of human settlement. This one wasn't, and the reason it wasn't has everything to do with who was allowed inside it and who wasn't. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, home to more than 20,000 recorded animal species, including the European bison, the wisent, the heaviest land animal on the continent, an animal that went extinct in the wild everywhere else in Europe, and survived here specifically because this forest never stopped being wild enough to hold it. Here's the thing that doesn't get said enough about a forest this size. It isn't dangerous the way a haunted clearing is dangerous. It's dangerous the way scale is dangerous. Most of Białowieża's old-growth core has no real trail network running through it, because for 6 centuries almost nobody but royalty and their hunting parties was allowed deep enough inside to need one. Step off the handful of marked paths into that core and you're in genuinely primeval forest, dense enough and old enough that getting turned around isn't a remote possibility. It's the expected outcome for anyone who isn't specifically trained for it. Fallen giants, some of them centuries old themselves, lie tangled across the forest floor exactly where they dropped, because nobody has ever cleared them the way a managed woodland would be cleared. Climbing over and around that kind of deadfall for hours, with no clear sightline in any direction, is disorienting in a way that has nothing to do with folklore and everything to do with basic human geography. And the forest's more recent history adds a layer that has nothing to do with wilderness at all. Sections of Białowieża concealed wartime mass graves for decades before they were located, ground, disturbed, and then swallowed back up by growth thick enough to hide what had happened there from anyone who wasn't already looking for it specifically. A forest old enough to remember the end of the last ice age is also, that's the uncomfortable truth about a forest this dense and this old. The same density that protected 12,000 years of continuous growth from ever being cleared is just as good at protecting whatever gets buried inside it, whether that's a bison population extinct everywhere else, or something a lot darker that nobody wanted found. Białowieża's fame runs almost entirely through its wildlife documentaries and its UNESCO listing, the bison, the ancient oaks, the untouched Europe branding that draws hikers and researchers from around the world. That branding leaves out the layer that actually explains why a forest this celebrated is also a forest. People have genuinely vanished inside, both by accident and on purpose, across a much longer stretch of history than the tourism material tends to mention. Rangers and researchers who work inside the old-growth core still carry detailed maps and GPS equipment as standard practice, not as a formality, but as a genuine necessity, because the density and uniformity of the deep forest defeats casual navigation the same way it always has. Today, that 12,000-year survival is actively under threat. Logging pressure has pushed hard enough against what remains of the old-growth core that conservation groups describe it as the last stand for the largest untouched forest left in Europe. Whatever happens to Białowieża over the next few decades will decide whether a forest that outlasted the Ice Age, the Roman Empire, and 6 centuries of royal hunting parties survives the 21st century in anything close to the state it's been in since before recorded history started. Białowieża's danger is size and depth, 12,000 years of it, but the next forest on this list is small enough to walk across in an afternoon, and people still don't want to. Number 7. Wistman's Wood. The year is 1620, and you're a traveler making your way across Dartmoor when you come across a stand of trees unlike anything else on the moor. Oaks, but not the towering kind you'd expect. These are stunted, twisted, no taller than a man can reach to touch the top of with his own head, growing straight out of a jumbled field of granite boulders at nearly 1,300 feet of elevation. You write down what you see because it doesn't look like it belongs in England at all. It looks older than that, considerably older, as it turns out. Wistman's Wood likely dates back to at least 7,000 BC, a surviving fragment of the primeval forest that covered all of Dartmoor before most of it was cleared over the following millennia, stripped away for grazing land and timber by generations of settlers who left almost nothing of the original woodland standing anywhere else on the moor. The specific oaks standing there when you walk through in 1620 are themselves 400 to 500 years old, and they were already exactly this shape and exactly this size long before you arrived. That's not stunted growth from disease or damage. That's just what an oak becomes at this altitude, in this wind. Over 4 or 5 centuries of fighting the same exposed granite hillside for every inch it grows. The moss covering every trunk and boulder is thick enough to swallow the sound of your own footsteps, and the whole wood sits in a kind of permanent green half-light even at midday, low twisted branches, locking together overhead like something built rather than grown. Local legend has an explanation ready for why the wood looks the way it does, and it's been passed down long enough that nobody can say exactly when it started. Druids planted it, the story goes, which is one theory for where the name itself comes from. Wise man's wood, worn down over centuries of use into Wistman's. Whether or not a single druid ever set foot here, the name has stuck for longer than most recorded English history, attached to a patch of trees that already looked ancient when the story first started getting told. Nobody actually planted this wood in any deliberate sense. It grew the way forests grow, slowly and without a plan. But standing inside it, surrounded by boulders and moss and branches that seem to lean toward you from every direction at once, it's easy to understand why generations of people walking through it decided a human hand, or something older than human, had to be behind the way it looks. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The reason Wistman's Wood carries more than just a quaint local legend about tree-planting monks. It's named specifically as one of the primary hunting grounds of the wished hounds, enormous black dogs with blood-red eyes said to run the moor at night, sometimes led by the devil himself, sometimes by an older Dartmoor spirit called Old Crockern. They're part of the Devon Wild Hunt, a ghostly hunting party of huntsmen and hounds that rides across the moor on the worst storm nights of the year, and Wistman's Wood sits right at the center of where locals have always said that hunt begins. If you're enjoying this, subscribe, because the deeper we get into this list, the less these places sound like tourist stops, and the more they sound like somewhere you'd want a good reason to be standing. The wood's reputation reached all the way into English literature, without most readers ever realizing it. Arthur Conan Doyle is widely credited with drawing directly on a visit to Wistman's Wood and on the local wild hunt legend surrounding it when he wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles. A monstrous black hound, loose on a fog-choked moor, came straight out of Dartmoor's own centuries-old folklore, filtered through a writer who'd stood exactly where that folklore said the hunt begins, and turned into one of the most famous horror stories in the English language. What makes Wistman's Wood different from almost everything else on this list is scale. You could walk across the entire wood in under an hour. No body count. No missing persons case with a name attached to it. Just a few acres of oaks, older than most of the built world around them, sitting in a permanent green twilight at the exact spot where an entire county's worth of ghost stories all seem to converge. Small isn't the same as safe. Sometimes it just means the dread has less room to hide in, and somehow that makes it worse. Hikers who visit during the day describe it as peaceful, almost sleepy, right up until the light starts to change in the late afternoon, and the same moss-covered boulders that looked charming an hour earlier start looking like something else entirely. Most of them leave before dark. The ones who don't tend not to talk about it afterward in much detail. Local advice for anyone determined to stay past sunset is blunt and consistent, repeated by nearly everyone who lives near the moor. Don't, and if you must, don't go alone. Wistman's Wood is small and English, and still unset foot and able after dark, by the account of nearly everyone who lives near it. Therefore, on the other side of the English Channel, an entire real forest got written into legend as the place a wizard never leaves. Number 8. Forêt de Brocéliande. The year is the late 1100s, and you're a medieval writer named Chrétien de Troyes, sitting down to write the story that will eventually attach itself permanently to a real forest in Brittany. You call it Brocéliande, and you write it as the Forest of Wonders, the place where the wizard Merlin meets his end, trapped forever by the enchantress Viviane. It's fiction. You know it's fiction. But the forest you're describing already has a name in the local dialect, Brocélian, and the people who live near it have been telling their own version of a magical forest story long before you ever put pen to parchment. What you write doesn't invent the legend so much as give it a shape that outlives you by nearly 1,000 years. That forest is real. It's the Forest of Paimpont, still standing today in Brittany, and the association between the real trees and Chrétien's legendary Brocéliande has held since at least the 13th century, when locals were already calling their own forest by the name from the story. Most legendary forests stay legendary, confined to the page and never quite pinned to an actual patch of ground you can drive to. This one has a real address, a real parking lot, and a real trail map, and every location on that map corresponds to a specific beat in an 800-year-old story about a wizard who never existed. Here's where it gets specifically strange. In the late 1800s, researchers working in the northeastern part of the forest came upon an actual Neolithic gallery grave, a real megalithic burial structure, thousands of years old, built by people who have nothing to do with Arthurian legend and predate it by millennia. These structures exist scattered across Brittany in real numbers, stone chambers built by communities who left no written record explaining what they meant by them. Only the stones themselves, and whatever the builders intended, a few thousand years before anyone had heard of Camelot. Instead of treating it as what it was, an ancient tomb from a completely different era of human history, They identified it as the physical site of Merlin's death, the exact spot where Vivienne trapped him. The tomb is still marked today. Visitors still walk out to it specifically to see Merlin's tomb, a real archaeological structure permanently rebranded around a fictional wizard because a 19th century research team decided that's what it should be. That's not a typo, by the way. An actual Neolithic burial site, thousands of years older than the legend attached to it, still gets visited today under the name of a character who never existed. The forest absorbed the story instead of just inspiring it, folding real archaeology into fiction so completely that most visitors walking the path to Merlin's tomb have no idea they're standing at a genuine prehistoric grave. Somewhere underneath the fictional wizard's fictional prison lies a real body, buried by real people, for real reasons that have nothing to do with sorcery or enchantment, and almost nobody who visits ever stops to think about who that person actually was. The forest holds more than one of these sites. Deep inside Paimpont sits the Val Sans Retour, the Valley of No Return, where legend says the sorceress Morgan Le Fay trapped any knight who had ever been unfaithful, holding them inside an enchantment until Lancelot finally broke the spell that held them there. And elsewhere in the forest, the Fountain of Barrington marks the specific spring where Merlin is said to have first met Vivienne, the woman who would eventually imprison him for good. These aren't vague regional legends, attached loosely to a general area. They're named, mapped, specific locations inside one continuous stretch of real French woodland, each one carrying its own piece of the same centuries-old story, and every single one of them is a place you can actually stand in, not a setting confined to the pages of a medieval romance. And the timing of what happened next is almost too perfect to be coincidence. A medieval writer invents a forest of wonders. Locals adopt the name for their own real woods within a century. 19th century researchers find an actual ancient tomb and decide it belongs to a fictional wizard. Every layer added to Brocéliande over 800 years has done the same thing, taken something that was already there, a name, a valley, a burial site, a spring, and folded it permanently into the same expanding legend, until most visitors walking the forest today can no longer tell which parts are history and which parts are the story built on top of it. Even the forest's ordinary geography has gotten pulled into it. Springs, boulders, hollows in the ground that would draw no attention anywhere else in France get their own named place in the story here, because once a forest gets absorbed into a legend this thoroughly, there's no such thing as a feature that's just scenery anymore. Everything gets assigned a role. It's the same instinct behind nearly every forest on this list. Different culture after different culture deciding a real place needs a story dangerous enough to explain why people go in and don't always come back. Brocéliande's danger is mythic, built out of 8 centuries of legend wrapping itself around real ground. But across the channel, one English forest's most infamous death is a real king, with a real unsolved question still attached to it. Number 9. The New Forest. The year is 1079. You're a Norman surveyor working for William the Conqueror, and you've just finished marking out the boundaries of his newest hunting reserve in southwest Hampshire. He calls it the New Forest, which is a strange name for something that will still be called that nearly 1,000 years later, long after every other new thing from this era has become simply old. William wants it kept exactly as it is, dense woodland and open heath, set aside for deer, off-limits to the kind of common use that governs most of the surrounding countryside. From this year forward, it's a royal forest, protected by its own set of laws, answerable directly to the crown. For nearly 2 decades afterward, the forest does exactly what William intended it to do. Deer are protected under laws harsh enough that killing one without permission could cost a commoner their hand or worse, while the king and his hunting parties ride through the same woods whenever the mood takes them. It's a private playground enforced with the full weight of Norman law, and almost nobody outside the royal court has any real say over what happens inside its boundaries. 21 years later, on August 2nd, 1100, that royal forest produces the death that makes it famous. King William II, known to everyone as William Rufus for his red hair and his flushed complexion, rides into the New Forest on a hunting trip with a small party that includes his own younger brother Henry and a Norman nobleman named Walter Tyrrell. Rufus wasn't a popular king. He'd helped himself to church funds, alienated the nobility, and treated the people under him with open contempt, so when an arrow fired by Tyrrell, aimed at a stag, misses its target and strikes the king in the chest instead, nobody in England is exactly devastated. Here's where it gets strange. Walter Tyrrell doesn't stay to explain what happened. He flees the country immediately, before anyone can question him about the shot that killed a king. And Henry, the king's own brother standing right there in the hunting party, doesn't linger over the body either. Within days, he's crowned king himself, moving with a speed that historians have never fully been able to explain away as simple readiness. An arrow that misses a stag and finds a king by accident is easy enough to believe, right up until you factor in the brother who happened to be present for it and happened to be crowned within the week, and English history has never definitively settled which version is true. No trial ever followed. No formal inquiry pinned down whether the shot really was an accident. Tyrrell himself, in the years after fleeing, reportedly denied ever firing the fatal shot at all, which only deepens the confusion rather than resolving it. Either a frightened man lied about killing his king by accident, or the official story handed down for 9 centuries isn't even the right account of who pulled the bow. In an era when kings answered to almost nobody, the death of one inside his own private hunting reserve, witnessed only by the men who benefited most from his absence, simply got recorded, mourned by almost no one, and left there. 900 years later, we still don't even know exactly where it happened. The Rufus Stone, standing today near the village of Minstead, marks the traditional spot where William Rufus is said to have died, a monument people have been visiting for centuries, as though the location were settled fact. Recent research suggests the actual site may be somewhere closer to Beaulieu instead, a different location entirely. Even the ground itself refuses to give up a clean answer. We can't confirm exactly where a king died inside this forest, let alone confirm exactly why. And no, this isn't a story someone invented for a documentary. The forest itself still runs, in places, under an ancient legal system called commoning, a set of grazing and land use rights that predates most of English common law and has survived, largely unchanged, since long before William Rufus ever rode into these trees. Ponies still graze freely across the open heath the way they have for centuries. Certain rights over the land are still held by local commoners rather than by the crown or the state, an arrangement that has quietly outlasted the entire monarchy that originally created the forest to serve its own hunting interests. Walk through the New Forest today, and you're walking through one of the only places in England where a legal system this old is still doing the exact job it was built to do, in the exact woodland it was built for, under rules a Norman king would still recognize if he somehow found his way back. Now, William Rufus could have stopped there, one more medieval king lost to a hunting accident nobody thought twice about at the time. He didn't. The uncertainty around his death turned into one of English history's longest-running unresolved questions, still argued over by historians 9 centuries later, still marked by a stone that might not even be in the right place. A forest set aside for one king's private hunting pleasure ended up being the last place that same king ever stood, and it's kept the details of exactly how and exactly where to itself ever since. 9 forests down, each one a real place with a real reason people don't go in without a good excuse. Therefore, the last one on this list doesn't need a legend at all. It just needs a map, and the map still can't account for everyone who's gone in and never come back out. Number 10. The Alaska Triangle Wilderness. The year is 1988, roughly where most of the modern record-keeping on this region starts to take shape. You're a search and rescue coordinator working out of Anchorage, and the map on your wall covers a stretch of Alaska bounded roughly by Anchorage, Juneau, and Utqiagvik, an area people have started calling the Alaska Triangle. It isn't a neat geometric shape, just roughly 200,000 square miles of glaciers, mountains, and dense boreal forest, more territory than most countries, and almost none of it is reachable by road. When someone goes missing out here, you're not sending a car, you're sending a plane, if the weather even allows it, into terrain that swallows evidence the way almost nowhere else on Earth can manage. The number that gets attached to this region is staggering, and it's worth being straight about where it comes from before repeating it. Multiple outlets have cited a figure of somewhere between 16,000 and 20,000 people gone missing across Alaska since 1988, a number that circulates constantly in articles and documentaries about the triangle without a single, consistently cited original source behind it. That doesn't mean the underlying problem is invented. Alaska genuinely has a disproportionate missing persons rate for its population, driven by exactly the terrain you're looking at on that map. It means the specific headline number should be treated as a widely repeated claim, not a verified government total, and the honest version of this story doesn't need to inflate it to be terrifying. Think about the scale of the search problem on its own terms for a second. 200,000 square miles is bigger than the entire state of California, bigger than most European countries, and outside of a handful of towns and a thin network of highways, almost none of it has ever had a permanent human presence. When a plane goes down out here, or a hiker doesn't check in when they said they would, the search area is a wilderness large enough that entire search efforts have been called off, not because anyone gave up, but because the mathematics of covering that much terrain in that kind of weather, with the resources available, simply run out before the search does. Here's where it gets strange, and where the terrain itself does more explaining than any legend could. Alaska's glaciers aren't solid the way they look from a distance. They're honeycombed underneath with hidden crevasses, some of them larger than office buildings, concealed under a crust of snow that can hold a person's weight right up until it doesn't. A hiker, a snowmobile, even a downed aircraft can disappear into one of these voids and leave nothing visible on the surface, no debris field, no trail, nothing for a search plane flying overhead to spot. Add in avalanches, whiteout conditions that can drop visibility to nothing in minutes, and stretches of forest and mountain that have never had a human footprint anywhere near them, and you've got a landscape that doesn't need any help hiding the people who go missing inside it. And somehow, it gets worse. If you're one of the 2 indigenous peoples who've lived alongside this wilderness, far longer than anyone's been keeping missing persons statistics. The Tlingit and Tsimshian peoples tell stories of the Kushtaka, an otter-like shapeshifter that stalks the wilderness looking for the lost and the vulnerable. It doesn't chase. It doesn't need to. The Kushtaka is said to appear as someone the lost person trusts, a friend, a guide, a familiar voice calling out through the trees, leading its target deeper into terrain they'll never find their way back out of. Strip away the shape-shifting, and what's left is a description of exactly how people actually go missing out here. Trusting a shortcut, following a landmark that turns out to be wrong, walking toward a sound that isn't what they thought it was, in a landscape engineered by geology to make every one of those mistakes fatal. Every single culture in this video, Romanian, Japanese, German, English, French, Polish, Brazilian, American, and Alaska Native, arrived independently, with no contact between any of them, at the same conclusion about their own deep woods. Something in there is watching for the moment you stop paying attention, and it will use whatever you trust most against you. Whether any single one of those legends is literally true matters less than why these cultures, across 10 centuries, kept building the same story about the same kind of place, somewhere old enough, dense enough, and dangerous enough that going in alone was never actually a good idea. Tell us which of these 10 forests you'd never set foot in. Tell us exactly where you're watching this from tonight, and subscribe for more places the map still can't fully explain.